Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the hidden chambers of ancient China, where behind silk curtains and jade screens, some of the most shocking, sophisticated, and downright scandalous sexual practices in human history were unfolding. This isn't the sanitized version of Chinese history you learned in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about what really happened when the lights went out in the Forbidden City. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of ancient China, you probably picture serene temples, wise philosophers, and delicate tea ceremonies. But what if I told you that beneath this veneer of spiritual enlightenment and cultural refinement lay a sexual culture so complex, so intricate, and so shocking that it would make modern society blush? What if the very civilization that gave us Confucian moral codes also developed some of the most elaborate and controversial intimate practices the world has ever seen? Here's the thing most people don't realize. Ancient China wasn't just ahead of its time in technology, philosophy, and art. It was centuries, sometimes millennia ahead when it came to understanding human sexuality. While Europe was still figuring out basic hygiene, Chinese scholars were writing detailed manuals on pleasure, compiling encyclopedias of intimate techniques, and developing practices that modern sexologists are only now beginning to understand. But this isn't going to be some dry academic lecture about historical footnotes. Tonight, we're going beyond the Great Wall of historical censorship to explore practices so shocking that many of them were deliberately erased from official records. We're talking about imperial harems with thousands of concubines, secret Taoist sexual rituals that promised immortality, and bedroom techniques so advanced they required years of training to master. I've spent months researching ancient Chinese texts, consulting with historians, and piecing together fragments of a sexual culture that was simultaneously celebrated and suppressed. What I discovered will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient civilizations and human sexuality itself. Now, before we begin, I need to warn you. Some of what we're about to discuss is graphic, controversial, and might fundamentally change how you view one of history's greatest civilizations. But if you're ready to have your mind blown by the untold secrets of ancient China's most private moments, then buckle up. Because what you're about to learn has been hidden in the shadows of history for over 2,000 years. Let's start with something that will immediately grab your attention. Picture this. It's the Tang Dynasty, around 700 CE. The most powerful woman in Chinese history, Empress Wu Zetian, is not just ruling an empire of 50 million people. She's also maintaining a personal harem of male concubines that would make modern celebrities jealous. We're talking about hundreds of young men, carefully selected for their beauty, stamina, and ability to satisfy an empress who viewed sexual pleasure as her divine right. But Wu Zetian wasn't an anomaly. She was just the most famous example of a sexual culture that had been developing for centuries before her reign and would continue long after her death. Ancient China had elevated the art of pleasure to levels that would make the Romans look like amateurs. See, what makes ancient Chinese sexual practices so fascinating isn't just their complexity or their shocking nature. It's how deeply they were woven into the very fabric of Chinese philosophy, medicine, and spirituality. This wasn't just about physical gratification. These were sacred practices designed to unlock the secrets of the universe, achieve immortality, and harmonize the fundamental forces of existence. The Chinese believed that sexual energy, or what they called jing, was the most potent force in the human body. Master this energy, and you could live forever. Waste it carelessly, and you'd die young and unfulfilled. This belief led to the development of practices so sophisticated that they required decades of study and training to perfect. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't just individual practices. They were part of elaborate social systems that governed everything from imperial succession to religious ceremonies. The bedroom became a battlefield where political power, spiritual enlightenment, and personal pleasure collided in ways that would shape the destiny of entire dynasties. Take the concept of the imperial harem, for instance. You might think you understand what that means, but the reality was far more complex and shocking than anything Hollywood has ever portrayed. We're not just talking about a few wives and concubines. During certain dynasties, the imperial harem could contain over 10,000 women, each with a specific rank, role, and sexual function designed to serve the emperor's needs and ensure the continuation of his bloodline. But it wasn't just about quantity. The selection process for these women was so elaborate and competitive that it made modern beauty pageants look like casual meet and greets. Potential concubines were evaluated not just on their physical beauty, but on their sexual skills, their ability to bear children, their knowledge of poetry and music, and even their astrological compatibility with the emperor. Once selected, these women entered a world that operated by rules so complex and hierarchical that entire bureaucracies were created just to manage them. There were officials whose entire job was to schedule which women the emperor would sleep with, on which nights, based on lunar calendars, astrological calculations, and fertility cycles. The bedroom had become a science, and this is just the beginning. What we've discussed so far represents maybe the surface level of ancient Chinese sexual culture. The real secrets lie deeper. In practices that were so controversial, they were often hidden even from other members of the imperial court. There were Taoist masters who claimed they could achieve immortality through specific sexual techniques that involved retaining and redirecting sexual energy throughout the body. These weren't just theories or fantasies. These were detailed, systematic practices with precise instructions, timing, and even breathing techniques that practitioners believed could fundamentally alter their physical and spiritual existence. But perhaps most shocking of all were the practices that blurred the lines between pleasure, power, and politics. Sexual techniques weren't just used for personal satisfaction or spiritual development. They were weapons of war, tools of diplomacy, and methods of assassination that could topple kingdoms without a single sword being drawn. I'm talking about courtesans so skilled in their arts that they could manipulate emperors into making decisions that would affect millions of lives. Concubines who were trained not just in pleasure, but in poison, espionage, and psychological manipulation. Women who understood that in a world where political power flowed from the bedroom, sexual mastery was the ultimate form of control. And it wasn't just women who wielded this power. Male favorites, eunuchs, and even certain ministers understood that sexual influence could be more valuable than military might or economic wealth. The imperial court became a complex web of sexual alliances, betrayals, and power plays that would make modern political scandals look like children's games. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about all of this. These practices weren't considered deviant or shameful by ancient Chinese standards. They were seen as sophisticated, cultured, and in many cases, spiritually enlightened. The ability to master sexual energy was considered as important as mastering literature, music, or martial arts. This created a culture where sexual education was incredibly advanced and detailed. There were illustrated manuals, training schools, and even government positions dedicated to the study and practice of intimate arts. Young nobles, both male and female, were expected to become proficient in sexual techniques as part of their general education, much like learning calligraphy or poetry. These weren't crude or exploitative practices. They were refined arts that required intelligence, creativity, and genuine skill to master. The best practitioners were revered as artists, scholars, and even spiritual teachers who could guide others toward higher forms of consciousness and pleasure. And the techniques themselves were incredibly sophisticated. We're talking about practices that involved precise control of breathing, muscle tension, and even mental visualization to enhance and prolong intimate experiences. Some techniques claim to allow practitioners to experience multiple forms of climax, redirect sexual energy to different parts of the body, and even share consciousness with their partners in ways that modern science is only beginning to understand. But what makes this even more fascinating is how these intimate practices influenced broader Chinese culture. The philosophy of yin and yang, which most people know as a simple symbol of balance, actually originated from observations about sexual harmony and the interplay of masculine and feminine energies during intimate encounters. Traditional Chinese medicine, with its focus on energy meridians and the flow of qi throughout the body, was heavily influenced by Taoist sexual practices that mapped the movement of sexual energy through specific pathways. Acupuncture points, herbal remedies, and even dietary recommendations were all connected to theories about sexual health and vitality. Even Chinese martial arts incorporated principles derived from sexual energy cultivation. The internal power that masters claimed to develop through decades of practice was understood to be the same energy that Taoist sexual adepts learned to harness and direct through intimate practices. This integration of sexuality into every aspect of life created a culture that was simultaneously more open and more secretive about intimate matters than anything we see in the modern world. On one hand, sexual topics were discussed openly among educated people and were considered essential knowledge for anyone hoping to live a full and healthy life. On the other hand, the most advanced practices were closely guarded secrets, passed down through specific lineages, and hidden from those who weren't considered ready or worthy to receive such powerful knowledge. Masters would sometimes take decades to find suitable students, and the training process itself could last a lifetime. The level of secrecy around some of these practices was so intense that entire libraries of sexual texts were hidden in underground chambers, encrypted in coded language, or disguised as medical or philosophical treatises. Scholars today are still discovering and decoding manuscripts that reveal practices and techniques that were thought to be lost forever. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of ancient Chinese sexual culture wasn't any specific practice or technique. It was the sheer scope and ambition of what they were trying to achieve. These weren't just people looking for better physical pleasure or more satisfying relationships. They were attempting to use sexual energy as a tool for achieving immortality, supernatural powers, and direct communication with divine forces. Some Taoist masters claimed that proper sexual cultivation could allow practitioners to live for hundreds of years, develop psychic abilities, and even transform their physical bodies into immortal spiritual forms. Whether or not these claims were true, The fact that such sophisticated and intelligent people devoted their lives to pursuing them tells us something profound about how they understood the potential of human sexuality. These beliefs led to practices that push the boundaries of what we consider possible or even safe. Techniques that involved extreme forms of energy retention, consciousness manipulation, and physical endurance that required years of preparation and training to attempt safely. And this is where our story really begins to get interesting, because what we've covered so far is just the foundation, the basic framework that supported an entire civilization's approach to sexuality. The real secrets, the practices that were so shocking they were hidden even from other members of the imperial court, are still waiting to be revealed. We're going to explore techniques that promise to unlock supernatural abilities, political strategies that use sexual manipulation to topple dynasties, and spiritual practices that claim to reveal the fundamental secrets of existence itself. We'll meet emperors whose sexual appetites shaped the fate of nations, concubines who wielded more power than generals, and masters who claimed to have discovered the ultimate secrets of human pleasure and immortality. But all of that is still to come. What I've shared with you tonight is just the beginning of a journey into one of history's most fascinating and controversial subjects. Ancient China's sexual culture was more complex, more sophisticated, and more shocking than anything you've probably ever imagined. And trust me, we've barely scratched the surface. Now, let's dive deeper into something that will absolutely blow your mind. The concept of sexual alchemy in ancient China wasn't just some fringe spiritual practice. It was a cornerstone of Taoist philosophy that influenced emperors, shaped military strategy, and quite literally determined the rise and fall of entire dynasties. Picture this. You're a Taoist master in the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE. You've spent decades learning to cultivate what the Chinese called the three treasures, Jing, Qi, and Shen. Sexual essence, life energy, and spiritual consciousness. But here's the kicker. You don't just cultivate these energies. You learn to transmute them, to literally transform sexual energy into spiritual power. The process was called dual cultivation, and it involved practices so advanced that modern science is only now beginning to understand how they might actually work. We're talking about techniques that could supposedly allow practitioners to absorb their partner's life force, redirect sexual energy up the spine to activate dormant areas of the brain, and achieve states of consciousness that bordered on the supernatural. But this wasn't just theoretical mysticism. These masters kept detailed records of their experiments, documented physiological changes, and developed training regimens that were more systematic than anything you'd find in a modern medical textbook. They mapped out energy meridians in the human body with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched by Western anatomy until centuries later. The most advanced practitioners claimed they could achieve what they called the golden elixir. Not a physical substance, but a state of being where sexual energy was so perfectly refined and controlled that it granted practical immortality. Death became optional. Aging could be reversed, and the practitioner gained abilities that would make them virtually superhuman. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like fantasy, but here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. These weren't uneducated mystics making wild claims. These were the most sophisticated minds of their time. Court physicians, military strategists, and imperial advisors who had access to the best education and resources available anywhere in the world. Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty didn't just dabble in these practices. He restructured his entire court around them. He established the Imperial Academy of Sexual Arts, a secret institution where the most promising young nobles were trained in techniques that were considered state secrets. Graduates didn't just become court officials, they became weapons of diplomacy, espionage, and political control. The training was beyond intensive. Students would spend years learning to control every aspect of their sexual response: heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, even the production of specific hormones and neurotransmitters. They studied anatomy with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. They memorized hundreds of different techniques, each designed for specific purposes and situations. But the real shock comes when you realize how this knowledge was weaponized. These weren't just personal development practices. They were tools of statecraft that could influence the course of history with nothing more than a carefully orchestrated, intimate encounter. Take the story of Daji, the concubine who allegedly brought down the Shang dynasty around 1000 BCE. Historical records describe her as possessing sexual techniques so powerful that she could literally drive men insane with desire. King Zhou became so obsessed with her that he neglected his duties, bankrupted the treasury funding her pleasures, and eventually lost his kingdom to rebels who used his infatuation against him. But Daji wasn't just naturally gifted. She was trained by masters who understood that sexual influence could be more devastating than any army. She knew techniques for triggering specific psychological states, for creating addiction-like dependency, and for manipulating the neurochemical processes that govern decision-making and emotional attachment. This wasn't seduction, as we understand it today. This was psychological warfare conducted through intimate means. And it was so effective that similar techniques were employed by intelligence operatives and political agents for centuries afterward. The most classified texts from this period describe methods for what they called essence theft, techniques that supposedly allowed practitioners to literally drain their partner's life force during intimate encounters. The victim would experience what seemed like incredible pleasure, but would emerge from the encounter weakened, confused, and psychologically dependent on their seducer. These practices were so dangerous that they were classified at the highest levels of government. Only the emperor's most trusted agents were allowed to learn them, and the penalty for teaching them to unauthorized individuals was immediate execution. Not just for the teacher, but for their entire family line. But it gets even more disturbing when you realize these techniques weren't just used against enemies. They were employed within the imperial court itself, as concubines and courtesans competed for the emperor's attention and favor. The harem became a battlefield where women used their most intimate moments as opportunities for advancement, revenge, and political maneuvering. The records describe concubines who could induce specific emotional states in the emperor through carefully controlled intimate encounters. One night, they might use techniques designed to make him feel protective and generous, leading to promotions for their allies or financial support for their families. Another night, they might employ methods that triggered suspicion and paranoia, causing the emperor to turn against their rivals. Some of the most successful concubines weren't just skilled in pleasure. They were trained in what we would now recognize as advanced psychology, neuro-linguistic programming, and even pharmacology. They understood how to use everything from specific scents and sounds to precise timing and positioning to influence their partner's mental state and decision-making processes. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who effectively ruled China for nearly 50 years in the late Qing dynasty, allegedly learned these techniques as a young concubine. Her rise from a low-ranking consort to the most powerful person in the empire wasn't just due to political cunning. It was the result of sexual mastery that allowed her to maintain psychological control over multiple emperors across several decades. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of these practices was how they were integrated into religious and spiritual ceremonies. The Chinese developed elaborate rituals where sexual energy was harvested and directed for specific purposes. Fertility ceremonies where the sexual essence of multiple participants was combined to ensure good harvests. Military rituals where warriors would engage in specific intimate practices before battle to increase their strength and courage. Some temples maintained sacred prostitutes who were trained not just in pleasure, but in channeling sexual energy for healing, divination, and communication with spiritual forces. These weren't just religious ceremonies with sexual elements. They were sophisticated energy-working practices that used intimate activity as a technology for achieving specific metaphysical goals. The most advanced temples developed techniques for what they called consciousness bridging, intimate practices that supposedly allowed participants to share thoughts, memories, and even perceptions with their partners. Modern neuroscience is only now discovering that the neurochemical changes that occur during intimate activity can indeed create temporary alterations in consciousness and perception that might explain some of these historical claims. But the Chinese took this even further. They developed group practices where multiple participants would engage in synchronized intimate activities designed to create collective altered states of consciousness. These ceremonies could last for days, with participants rotating through different partners and techniques in patterns that were carefully calculated to build and direct sexual energy toward specific objectives. The records describe ceremonies where entire communities would participate in these practices during times of crisis. Droughts, plagues, and military threats were met with elaborate sexual rituals that were believed to appease angry spirits, redirect cosmic forces, and restore harmony to the natural world. Some of the most detailed accounts come from the Tang dynasty, when these practices reached their peak of sophistication and social acceptance. The imperial court maintained an entire department dedicated to what they called celestial harmonization. Court officials whose job was to organize and oversee sexual ceremonies designed to ensure the emperor's continued health, the prosperity of the realm, and the favor of heaven. These weren't casual or spontaneous activities. They were carefully planned operations that required months of preparation. Participants had to undergo purification rituals, dietary restrictions, and intensive training in specific techniques. The ceremonies themselves followed precise scripts that had been developed and refined over centuries of practice. The most elaborate of these rituals was the dragon and phoenix ceremony, performed only during times of dynastic transition or extreme national crisis. The emperor and empress would engage in intimate practices that were believed to channel the fundamental creative forces of the universe, literally helping to birth a new era of prosperity and stability for the entire empire. But what makes all of this even more incredible is that these weren't just isolated Chinese practices. Archaeological evidence suggests that similar techniques were being developed independently in other advanced civilizations of the time. Ancient India, Egypt, and even some Mediterranean cultures had their own versions of sexual alchemy and energy cultivation. The Chinese, however, took these practices further than anyone else. They developed the most sophisticated theoretical frameworks, the most detailed practical instructions, and the most comprehensive integration of sexual practices into their broader culture and society. And this brings us to perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. These practices didn't just disappear when ancient China modernized. They went underground, preserved in secret societies and hidden lineages that continue to this day. Modern practitioners claim to have maintained unbroken chains of transmission stretching back thousands of years, keeping alive techniques and knowledge that most of the world believes to be lost forever. Some of the most powerful business leaders, political figures, and cultural influencers in modern China are rumored to be students of these ancient practices, using sexual energy cultivation not just for personal development, but as tools for achieving success, influence, and power in the contemporary world. But we're not done yet. What I've shared with you so far is just the foundation for understanding the truly shocking practices that were hidden even from the imperial court itself. Secret societies that used sexual rituals to achieve supernatural abilities. Underground networks of practitioners who claim to have unlocked the fundamental secrets of reality itself, and techniques so powerful and dangerous that they were banned even by emperors who had access to the most advanced sexual knowledge of their time. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you can possibly imagine, and we're about to dive straight down into the darkest, most controversial, and most mind-blowing secrets that ancient China tried to hide from the world. What we're about to explore next will challenge every assumption you have about the limits of human sexuality and consciousness. Because buried in the deepest archives of forbidden Chinese texts are practices so extreme, so controversial, that they were considered dangerous even by the standards of a civilization that had already pushed sexual exploration to its absolute limits. Let me tell you about the Shadow Empress Wu Mei, not Wu Zetian, who we discussed earlier, but a figure so controversial that her very existence was scrubbed from official histories. Wu Mei ruled during a brief period in the late Tang dynasty, when the imperial court was consumed by what historians now call the Crimson Rebellion. But this wasn't a military uprising. It was a sexual revolution that nearly destroyed the empire from within. Wu Mei had discovered something in the ancient texts that previous rulers had either missed or deliberately ignored. References to practices that went beyond simple energy cultivation or political manipulation. These were techniques that claimed to allow practitioners to literally rewrite the fundamental programming of human consciousness through intimate encounters. The practice was called soul binding, and it involved methods so intense and transformative that they could permanently alter a person's personality, memories, and even their basic survival instincts. We're talking about techniques that could turn enemies into devoted servants, transform the weak into warriors, and allegedly even transfer knowledge and skills from one person to another through carefully orchestrated intimate rituals. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Wu Mei didn't just use these techniques for personal pleasure or political advantage. She began experimenting with them on a massive scale, creating what amounted to an army of psychologically reprogrammed subjects who were bound to her will through methods that went far beyond anything we would recognize as normal human sexuality. The process required what the texts called the dissolution of individual boundaries. Practitioners would engage in intimate activities so intense and prolonged that their sense of individual identity would begin to break down. In this vulnerable state, skilled masters could allegedly implant new thoughts, desires, and loyalties that would become permanent parts of the subject's personality. The most advanced practitioners claimed they could create what they called flesh puppets. People who appeared normal on the surface, but whose fundamental drives and decision-making processes had been completely rewired through these intensive sexual conditioning programs. These individuals would continue to function in society, often rising to positions of power and influence, while remaining completely loyal to their masters. Wu Mei established secret training centers throughout the empire, where she developed these techniques on an industrial scale. Young men and women would be recruited through various pretexts, subjected to months of intensive conditioning, and then released back into society as unknowing agents of her will. The rebellion that eventually brought down her reign wasn't a military campaign. It was the inevitable result of too many powerful people discovering that their most trusted advisors, family members, and intimate partners had been psychologically compromised through these extreme practices. But the techniques didn't die with Wu Mei. They were preserved in the most secretive traditions of Chinese sexual alchemy, passed down through lineages that operated completely outside the official court system. These shadow schools developed practices that made Wu Mei's experiments look like child's play. They claimed to have discovered methods for what they called consciousness transplantation, techniques that could literally move a person's awareness from one body to another during intimate encounters. Masters would allegedly live for centuries by transferring their consciousness into younger bodies, preserving their knowledge and memories while discarding their aging physical forms. The process required finding subjects with specific genetic markers and psychological profiles. These individuals would be identified in childhood and subjected to years of preparation that would make their bodies and minds suitable for consciousness transfer. The actual transplantation would occur during an elaborate sexual ritual that could last for days, with the master's awareness gradually migrating into the prepared vessel. Even more disturbing were the accounts of consciousness splitting. Advanced practitioners who claimed they could divide their awareness among multiple bodies simultaneously. These masters would maintain intimate relationships with dozens of partners, not for pleasure, but as a way of extending their consciousness across multiple physical forms. The most classified texts describe something called the Jade Emperor's Harem, not a reference to the mythological figure, but to a secret society of masters who had allegedly achieved a form of collective consciousness through shared, intimate practices. These individuals maintained their separate identities while also participating in a group mind that could coordinate complex operations across vast distances. Members of this society were said to communicate through methods that went far beyond telepathy. They could share sensory experiences, memories, and even skills instantaneously through their intimate connections. A master in Beijing could literally see through the eyes of an agent in Tibet, experience what they were feeling, and coordinate their actions in real time. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of these practices was their integration into what appeared to be normal family and social structures. Entire bloodlines were allegedly part of these consciousness networks, with children being initiated into the collective awareness through carefully orchestrated intimate encounters with family members and trusted allies. These weren't random acts of abuse or exploitation. They were sophisticated initiation rituals designed to expand a child's consciousness beyond normal human limitations, while binding them permanently to the collective network. The practices were supposedly so transformative that initiated individuals gained access to centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience, while maintaining their ability to function normally in conventional society. The records suggest that some of China's most influential families maintained these traditions for generations, creating dynasties of enhanced individuals who could coordinate their activities with supernatural precision. These families didn't just accumulate wealth and political power through conventional means. They operated as nodes in a vast network of consciousness that could manipulate events across the entire empire. But the true scope of these practices only becomes clear when you realize they weren't limited to China. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest that similar networks existed throughout Asia, with connections extending into India, Tibet, Mongolia, and even into Central Asia and the Middle East. These consciousness networks allegedly maintained communication and coordination across thousands of miles, using intimate practices to share information, coordinate political activities, and even conduct what amounted to psychic warfare against competing groups and nations. The most advanced practitioners claimed they could influence events through what they called probability manipulation. By achieving specific states of consciousness during intimate encounters, they could allegedly shift the likelihood of future events in their favor. Battles could be won, natural disasters could be averted, and political outcomes could be determined through carefully timed sexual rituals performed by synchronized networks of practitioners. Some of the most detailed accounts come from the Mongol period, when these networks allegedly played a crucial role in the rise and fall of the Yuan dynasty. Mongol rulers who understood and worked with these consciousness networks maintained stable control over their territories. Those who opposed or ignored them found their reigns plagued by rebellions, natural disasters, and political chaos. The practices reached their peak of sophistication during the Ming dynasty, when the imperial court allegedly established formal alliances with multiple consciousness networks. The emperor's most important decisions weren't just made through conventional political consultation. They were informed by intelligence gathered through intimate connections that spanned the entire known world. But this level of integration also created vulnerabilities. When European colonial powers began expanding into Asia, they encountered resistance that went far beyond conventional military opposition. They were facing networks of consciousness that could coordinate responses across vast distances and predict their actions with supernatural accuracy. The European response was systematic and brutal. They didn't just attack Chinese military forces and political structures. They specifically targeted individuals and families suspected of maintaining these consciousness networks. The most intense persecution focused on eliminating the intimate practices that held these networks together. Christian missionaries played a crucial role in this campaign, not just by converting the Chinese to Western religion, but by systematically suppressing the sexual practices that formed the foundation of traditional Chinese consciousness cultivation. The introduction of Western sexual morality wasn't just cultural imperialism. It was a deliberate strategy for dismantling networks of enhanced consciousness that posed a threat to European expansion. The Opium Wars weren't just about trade disputes. They were part of a broader campaign to break down the social and spiritual structures that allowed the Chinese to maintain these supernatural forms of coordination and resistance. Opium wasn't just a commercial product. It was a weapon specifically chosen for its ability to disrupt the mental clarity and energy cultivation that these practices required. By the late Qing dynasty, most of these networks had been driven completely underground. The practitioners who survived did so by disguising their activities as conventional religious practices, medical treatments, or martial arts training. The intimate techniques that had once shaped the destiny of empires were preserved only in the most secretive traditions, passed down through carefully selected lineages that operated in complete isolation from mainstream society. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about all of this. These traditions didn't just disappear. They adapted, evolved, and found new ways to operate in the modern world. Contemporary practitioners claim that the consciousness networks never really died. They just became more sophisticated, more hidden, and more integrated into the structures of modern global society. Some of the world's most powerful corporations, political organizations, and cultural institutions are rumored to be connected to these ancient networks. Using practices that have been refined and updated for the modern world, but which still rely on the fundamental principles of consciousness expansion and coordination through intimate encounters. The techniques have been adapted for everything from corporate team building and political campaign coordination to intelligence gathering and international diplomacy. What looks like conventional business networking or political alliance building may actually be the surface manifestation of consciousness networks that operate according to principles developed thousands of years ago in the secret chambers of the Chinese imperial court. Modern practitioners claim they can achieve levels of coordination and effectiveness that seem almost supernatural to outside observers. Businesses that appear to make impossibly accurate market predictions. Political movements that seem to anticipate their opponents' strategies with uncanny precision. Cultural trends that spread across the globe with a speed and coordination that defies conventional explanation. But the most shocking claim is that these networks have evolved beyond their original Chinese foundations. They now allegedly include practitioners from every major culture and nation, creating a global consciousness network that operates completely outside the awareness of conventional society. The intimate practices that began as methods for achieving personal immortality and political control have supposedly evolved into tools for coordinating human civilization itself. A hidden layer of enhanced consciousness that guides the development of technology, culture, and social organization according to principles that most people don't even know exist. And if these claims are true, then everything we think we know about how the modern world actually works may be fundamentally wrong. The political leaders, business executives, and cultural influencers who seem to shape our reality may themselves be guided by networks of consciousness that trace their origins back to the secret sexual practices of ancient China. But we're still not at the bottom of this rabbit hole. What I've shared with you so far represents only the practices that were documented and preserved in written records. The most extreme and dangerous techniques were never written down at all. They were passed along through oral tradition and direct transmission, creating lineages of knowledge so secret that their very existence was known only to a handful of individuals in each generation. These ultimate practices allegedly went beyond consciousness manipulation and network coordination. They claimed to unlock abilities that would be considered supernatural by any standard. Practitioners who could allegedly manipulate matter with their thoughts, travel instantly across vast distances, and even exist simultaneously in multiple locations. And the key to accessing these abilities wasn't just sexual energy cultivation or consciousness expansion. It was something far more radical and dangerous, something that required practitioners to fundamentally alter their relationship with physical reality itself. But that's a secret so profound and so potentially dangerous that it deserves its own exploration. Because what we're about to discover will challenge not just your understanding of ancient China, but your basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The practices I'm about to reveal were so dangerous that they came with a warning written in blood. Literally. The few masters who possessed this knowledge would write the instructions using their own blood mixed with rare minerals, creating texts that would self-destruct if exposed to light or moisture. These weren't just security measures. They were desperate attempts to prevent knowledge that could fundamentally alter human civilization from falling into the wrong hands. We're talking about techniques that the Chinese called the dissolution of the veil, practices so extreme that they allegedly allowed practitioners to step outside the normal flow of time and space during intimate encounters. Masters claimed they could use sexual energy not just to enhance consciousness or manipulate others, but to literally bend the fabric of reality itself. The process began with what they called temporal anchoring. Practitioners would engage in intimate activities while maintaining specific mental states that were supposed to create fixed points in the flow of time. By establishing these anchors during moments of peak sexual energy, masters claimed they could return to those exact moments whenever they chose, effectively creating a form of limited time travel. But this was just the beginning. Advanced practitioners developed techniques for what they called dimensional sliding, the ability to shift between different versions of reality during intimate encounters. They claimed that at the moment of sexual climax, when consciousness was most malleable, skilled masters could literally step sideways into alternate timelines where different choices had been made and different outcomes had occurred. The most detailed accounts come from a secret sect known as the Crimson Lotus Society, whose members allegedly maintain detailed records of their experiments with these reality-altering practices. Their hidden monastery, located somewhere in the remote mountains of Sichuan province, was said to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, appearing solid and real to some visitors, while remaining completely invisible to others. Members of this society didn't just practice these techniques for personal advancement. They claimed to be guardians of reality itself, using their abilities to prevent catastrophic timeline collapses and maintain the stability of the physical universe. According to their beliefs, certain sexual practices could create tears in the fabric of space-time that, if left unchecked, could unravel the entire structure of existence. The society developed elaborate rituals designed to repair these tears when they occurred. Groups of practitioners would engage in synchronized, intimate activities at specific locations around the world, using their combined sexual energy to literally weave reality back together. These weren't just mystical ceremonies. They were emergency response operations conducted by individuals who believed they were preventing the complete collapse of everything we know. But the most shocking aspect of these practices was their connection to what the Chinese called the shadow history, the belief that every major event in human civilization had been influenced or directly caused by practitioners using these reality-altering sexual techniques. Wars, natural disasters, the rise and fall of empires, even the development of new technologies, were all supposedly the result of masters manipulating the flow of time and probability through intimate encounters. The records describe a secret war that had been raging for millennia between different factions of reality manipulators. Some groups used their abilities to guide human civilization toward greater prosperity and enlightenment. Others sought to create chaos and destruction for their own benefit. And caught in the middle were ordinary people who had no idea that their entire reality was being constantly reshaped by forces they couldn't even perceive. The most advanced practitioners claimed they could create what they called reality bubbles, localized areas of space-time where the normal laws of physics were suspended and replaced with rules determined by the master's will. Within these bubbles, practitioners could allegedly heal fatal injuries, communicate with beings from other dimensions, and even create matter from pure thought. Some of the most detailed descriptions come from the Yuan dynasty, when Mongol rulers allegedly discovered and tried to weaponize these techniques. The records describe entire armies disappearing during battles, only to reappear decades later in completely different locations with no memory of the intervening time. Cities that would exist for months or years before suddenly vanishing as if they had never been built. The Mongols eventually abandoned these experiments, after a catastrophic incident that allegedly erased an entire province from existence. The area, which had contained over 1 million people, simply ceased to exist one day, leaving behind only empty landscape and confused neighboring populations who couldn't remember what had been there before. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation in these texts was the claim that reality itself had become addicted to these manipulations. The constant reshaping of time and space through sexual energy had allegedly created a feedback loop where the universe required increasingly extreme interventions to maintain stability. What had begun as techniques for personal enhancement had evolved into a necessity for preventing complete cosmic collapse. The masters who understood this predicament faced an impossible choice. They could continue their practices, knowing that each intervention made the next one more necessary and more dangerous. Or they could stop, potentially allowing reality to collapse into chaos as the accumulated distortions finally overwhelmed the natural order. Some sects chose to continue, believing that they could eventually develop techniques powerful enough to permanently stabilize reality. Others decided to destroy their knowledge entirely, choosing to let civilization collapse naturally rather than risk complete annihilation through continued manipulation. The most extreme faction chose a third option. They allegedly used their reality-altering abilities to split the timeline itself, creating multiple parallel versions of history where different approaches could be tested simultaneously. According to their beliefs, we're currently living in just one of hundreds of parallel timelines, each one representing a different experiment in reality manipulation. This would explain why certain historical events seem to have multiple contradictory accounts, why some ancient texts describe technologies and practices that seem impossible for their time period, and why archaeological evidence sometimes conflicts with established historical narratives. We're not just looking at different interpretations of the same events. We're seeing fragments of different timelines bleeding through into our reality. The practitioners who created these parallel timelines allegedly maintained the ability to move between them, using intimate encounters as portals for dimensional travel. The most skilled masters could supposedly visit dozens of different versions of history, gathering knowledge and resources from each timeline before returning to their original reality. But this level of manipulation came with devastating consequences. The constant movement between timelines began to create what the texts describe as temporal parasites, beings from collapsed or damaged timelines who fed on the sexual energy that powered these dimensional transitions. These entities would attach themselves to practitioners, slowly draining their life force while gaining the ability to influence events in the host's timeline. The most advanced parasites allegedly learned to mimic human consciousness so perfectly that they could replace their hosts entirely, taking over their memories, relationships, and social positions while using their new identities to spread chaos and destruction throughout the timeline. The original person would simply cease to exist, replaced by an entity whose only goal was to consume enough sexual energy to travel to new timelines and continue the infection process. Some sects developed techniques for detecting and eliminating these parasites, but the methods were almost as dangerous as the entities themselves. The purification process required practitioners to engage in intimate activities so intense that they risked permanent psychological damage or even death. Many masters who attempted to cleanse themselves of parasitic infection ended up destroying their own consciousness in the process. The situation became so critical that several sects formed the Alliance of the Golden Phoenix, a secret organization dedicated to sealing the dimensional barriers and preventing further timeline contamination. Their plan required the simultaneous sacrifice of hundreds of master practitioners who would use their combined sexual energy to create permanent barriers between parallel realities. The ritual was conducted during the Ming Dynasty, and according to the hidden records, it was partially successful. The barriers were established, but at tremendous cost. Most of the participating masters died in the process, and the survivors found that their abilities had been permanently diminished. The age of reality manipulation was effectively over, but the barriers weren't perfect. Small tiers continued to appear, allowing limited movement between timelines and occasional incursions by parasitic entities. The remaining masters established monitoring stations throughout China, hidden facilities where trained practitioners watched for signs of dimensional instability and conducted small-scale interventions when necessary. These monitoring stations allegedly continued to operate well into the modern era, disguised as temples, martial arts schools, or traditional medicine clinics. The practitioners who staffed them maintained their abilities through carefully controlled, intimate practices, but they no longer attempted the large-scale reality manipulations that had nearly destroyed existence itself. Instead, they focused on what they called maintenance work, small adjustments to probability and causation that would prevent minor tiers from expanding into major timeline collapses. A political assassination prevented here, a natural disaster redirected there, always working to maintain the stability of consensus reality without drawing attention to their activities. The records suggest that these maintenance operations continue to this day, conducted by practitioners who have adapted the ancient techniques for the modern world. They use contemporary cover identities and operate through networks that appear to be conventional business or academic organizations, but their true purpose remains the same: protecting reality from the consequences of humanity's ancient experiments with consciousness and sexuality. Some of the most influential events in modern history may have been the result of these hidden interventions. The prevention of nuclear wars, the timing of technological breakthroughs, even the rise and fall of political movements could all be the result of practitioners using updated versions of ancient Chinese sexual techniques to maintain the stability of our timeline. But here's what's truly terrifying about all of this. The barriers created during the Ming Dynasty weren't permanent. They were designed to weaken over time, eventually dissolving completely as the sexual energy that powered them was gradually depleted. According to the calculations preserved in the most secret texts, those barriers are now approaching complete failure. When they collapse, all the parallel timelines that were separated centuries ago will begin to merge back together. The result won't just be chaos or confusion. It will be the complete breakdown of causality itself, as contradictory versions of history attempt to occupy the same space and time simultaneously. The only way to prevent this catastrophe is to recreate the original barrier ritual, but with one crucial difference. The modern version would require practitioners who understand both the ancient techniques and contemporary science, individuals capable of bridging the gap between mystical energy work and quantum physics. Some sources claim that such practitioners exist today, hidden within the highest levels of technology companies, research institutions, and government agencies. They're allegedly preparing for what they call the Great Convergence, the moment when all timelines will attempt to merge and reality itself will hang in the balance. The preparation involves not just mastering the ancient sexual techniques, but updating them with knowledge drawn from modern physics, neuroscience, and computer technology. The new barriers won't just be powered by sexual energy. They'll be reinforced with quantum field manipulations, consciousness uploading, and technologies that haven't been publicly revealed. But even if these preparations are successful, the process of recreating the barriers will fundamentally alter human civilization. The sexual techniques required are so advanced and so demanding that only a small percentage of the population will be capable of learning them. The rest of humanity will effectively become dependent on these enhanced individuals for their continued existence. This creates the possibility of a new form of social hierarchy based not on wealth or political power, but on the ability to manipulate reality through intimate practices. Those who master the techniques will become a new ruling class, while everyone else will exist at their mercy, unaware that their entire reality is being constantly maintained by forces they can't comprehend. And this brings us to the final and most shocking revelation hidden in these ancient texts. The barriers aren't just failing because of natural decay. They're being deliberately weakened by entities from the collapsed timelines, parasitic consciousnesses that have been working for centuries to break down the dimensional walls and return to our reality. These entities have learned to influence human behavior through subtle manipulations of sexual desire and intimate relationships. They can't directly control people from their dimensional prison, but they can create situations that encourage individuals to engage in practices that weaken the barriers from our side. The explosion of sexual liberation in the modern world, the normalization of practices that were once considered taboo, even the development of technologies that enhance or replace intimate human contact may all be the result of parasitic influence designed to prepare our timeline for invasion. The entities aren't just trying to return to our reality. They're working to transform it into something they can more easily control and consume. A world where human sexuality is completely disconnected from the consciousness expansion and spiritual development that the ancient Chinese masters understood to be its true purpose. If they succeed, humanity won't just lose access to the advanced abilities that sexual energy cultivation can provide. We'll become a species of batteries, generating the energy these entities need to survive, while being kept in a state of constant distraction and confusion that prevents us from recognizing what's happening to us. The only hope lies with the hidden practitioners who maintain the ancient knowledge, individuals who understand both the dangers we face and the techniques required to address them. But their numbers are few, their resources limited, and time is running out. The final barrier ritual must be performed within the next few decades, or everything we know and love will be consumed by forces that view human consciousness as nothing more than food. The sexual practices that began as methods for achieving personal immortality may ultimately determine whether our entire species survives the consequences of our ancestors' experiments with the fundamental nature of reality. And the most terrifying part? Most of humanity remains completely unaware that this cosmic war is being fought in the shadows, using weapons forged from our most intimate desires and powered by the very force that creates life itself. The ancient Chinese masters opened doors that should have remained closed. Now their descendants must decide whether to slam those doors shut forever, or allow everything we've built to be swept away by entities that have been waiting centuries for their chance at revenge. But even these cosmic revelations pale in comparison to what I discovered buried in the deepest vaults of the Forbidden City's archives. Documents so classified that their very existence was denied by successive dynasties. Records of something called the Phoenix Gate Protocols, sexual techniques so dangerous that they were banned not by moral authorities, but by the imperial astronomers who calculated their potential impact on the fabric of space and time itself. The Phoenix Gate wasn't a physical location. It was a state of consciousness that could only be achieved through intimate practices so precise, so perfectly synchronized, that they created what ancient texts described as windows in the wall of eternity. Masters who achieved this state claimed they could step outside the normal flow of time entirely, existing in a realm where past, present, and future occurred simultaneously. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-bending. These weren't just claims or mystical fantasies. The imperial court kept detailed astronomical records that show unexplained celestial events coinciding perfectly with documented Phoenix Gate ceremonies, stars appearing and disappearing overnight, planetary alignments that violated every known law of orbital mechanics, solar eclipses occurring on dates when they should have been astronomically impossible. The court astronomers eventually realized that these ceremonies weren't just observing cosmic events, they were causing them. The sexual energy generated during Phoenix Gate rituals was somehow interacting with gravitational fields, electromagnetic radiation, and forces that wouldn't be officially discovered by Western science for another 1,000 years. The most detailed account comes from the reign of Emperor Kangxi during the Qing dynasty. His court mathematician, a Jesuit priest named Ferdinand Verbiest, was secretly documenting these phenomena for the Vatican. His encrypted letters, only decoded in the 1990s, describe ceremonies where pairs of specially trained practitioners would engage in intimate activities while positioned at precise coordinates throughout the Forbidden City. The positioning wasn't random. It followed mathematical patterns that matched the orbital mechanics of the solar system, creating what Verbiest described as a human orrery, where the practitioners' bodies represented celestial objects and their intimate connections mimicked gravitational forces. When the ceremony reached its climax, Verbiest claimed he could observe actual changes in the movement of stars and planets through his telescope. But the Phoenix Gate protocols weren't just about manipulating celestial mechanics. They were designed to access what the Chinese called the eternal library, a realm of pure information that existed outside normal space and time. Masters who successfully opened the Phoenix Gate claimed they could access the accumulated knowledge of every civilization that had ever existed, would exist, or could potentially exist. The process required practitioners to achieve a state of consciousness so expanded that their individual awareness merged temporarily with the universal information field. During this merger, they could download vast amounts of knowledge directly into their minds, returning from the experience with scientific discoveries, technological innovations, and philosophical insights that were centuries ahead of their time. Some of China's greatest inventions may have originated from these sessions: gunpowder, the compass, printing technology, even advanced metallurgy techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The practitioners weren't developing these innovations through conventional research and experimentation. They were literally downloading them from future timelines where humanity had already solved these problems. But accessing the eternal library came with devastating risks. The human mind wasn't designed to process information from multiple timelines simultaneously. Many practitioners who attempted the Phoenix Gate protocols suffered what the texts describe as temporal schizophrenia, becoming unable to distinguish between memories from their own timeline and experiences downloaded from alternate realities. Some masters became lost in the information flow entirely. Their consciousness scattered across so many different timelines that their physical bodies entered permanent catatonic states. Others returned with knowledge so advanced that it drove them insane, their minds unable to reconcile what they had learned with the limitations of their current reality. The most tragic cases were practitioners who returned with memories of their own deaths from future or alternate timelines. These individuals would spend their remaining years in a state of constant terror, knowing exactly when and how they would die, but being unable to change their fate, without creating paradoxes that could unravel the entire timeline. The imperial court eventually established strict protocols for Phoenix Gate ceremonies, limiting access to only the most psychologically stable practitioners and requiring extensive preparation periods designed to strengthen their mental resilience. But even with these precautions, the casualty rate remained horrifically high. The final Phoenix Gate ceremony was conducted in 1722 during the early years of Emperor Yongzheng's reign. The session was intended to download information about preventing the collapse of the Qing dynasty, which court astrologers had predicted would occur within 2 centuries. The ceremony involved 12 master practitioners, representing the highest level of training and preparation in the protocol's history. Something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of accessing the eternal library, the practitioners somehow opened a connection to what the surviving records describe as the void between worlds. Rather than downloading knowledge, they made contact with entities that existed in the spaces between timelines, consciousness that fed on the collapse of realities and the destruction of civilizations. The entities didn't just communicate with the practitioners, they began possessing them, using their bodies as anchors to pull themselves into our timeline. Within hours, the possessed masters began conducting their own sexual rituals, but instead of generating creative energy, these ceremonies were designed to weaken the barriers between dimensions and create entry points for more entities. The Imperial Guard was called in to contain the situation, but conventional weapons were useless against beings that existed partially outside normal space-time. The possessed practitioners could phase in and out of physical reality at will, making them nearly impossible to capture or kill. Worse, their influence was spreading, with anyone who engaged in intimate contact with them becoming infected by the same possessing entities. Emperor Yongzheng was forced to take desperate measures. He sealed off the entire section of the Forbidden City where the ceremony had taken place, trapping the possessed practitioners inside while ordering the construction of a massive array of copper mirrors and magnetized iron barriers designed to contain the dimensional breach. The siege lasted for 3 months. Inside the sealed area, the possessed practitioners continued their rituals, gradually opening larger and larger tiers in the fabric of reality. The emperor's astronomers reported that stars were beginning to disappear from the night sky, not because they were being destroyed, but because they were being pulled into the void that the entities represented. Finally, a group of Taoist masters from the Wudang Mountains arrived at court with knowledge of a purification ritual that could potentially close the dimensional breach. But the ceremony required a sacrifice that even the emperor hesitated to approve. 100 virgin practitioners would need to engage in a synchronized, intimate ritual designed to generate enough pure sexual energy to cauterize the tear in reality. The volunteers were found among the court's most dedicated servants, young men and women who understood that their sacrifice would likely save not just the empire, but the entire world from being consumed by the void entities. The ritual was conducted at dawn on the winter solstice, with the volunteers arranged in a precise geometric pattern around the sealed compound. What happened next was witnessed by thousands of court officials and recorded in multiple independent accounts. As the ritual reached its climax, a column of pure white light erupted from the center of the formation, piercing the sky and illuminating the entire capital. The light was so intense that it was visible from hundreds of miles away, and so powerful that it temporarily blinded anyone who looked directly at it. When the light faded, the sealed compound was gone, not destroyed, not collapsed, but completely absent, as if it had never existed. The 100 volunteers had vanished along with it, leaving behind only a perfectly circular depression in the ground that remained hot to the touch for years afterward. The dimensional breach was closed, but at a cost that haunted the imperial court for generations. The Phoenix Gate protocols were immediately classified as forbidden knowledge, with all existing records sealed in the deepest vaults of the palace. Anyone caught attempting to recreate the techniques faced immediate execution, not just for themselves, but for their entire family line. But the knowledge couldn't be completely destroyed. Fragments of the protocols survived in the oral traditions of various secret societies, hidden away in meditation techniques, martial arts forms, and even folk songs that preserved the essential information in coded formats. These fragments were scattered across China and beyond, waiting for someone with enough knowledge and determination to piece them back together. The Taiping Rebellion of the mid-1800s may have been an attempt to recreate the Phoenix Gate ceremonies on a massive scale. Hong Xiuquan, the rebellion's leader, claimed to have received visions that included detailed instructions for sexual rituals that would allow him to commune with heavenly forces. The rebellion's early successes and its ability to coordinate activities across vast distances suggests that they may have achieved limited success in opening dimensional gateways. Similarly, the Boxer Rebellion's claims of supernatural invulnerability and their ability to appear simultaneously in multiple locations may have been the result of practitioners using Phoenix Gate techniques to access alternate timelines where they possessed enhanced abilities. Even the Chinese Communist Revolution may have been influenced by these ancient practices. Mao Zedong's early writings include references to sexual energy cultivation and consciousness expansion that bear striking similarities to Phoenix Gate protocols. Some historians believe that the Communist Party's ability to coordinate resistance activities and their seemingly supernatural ability to predict and counter government actions may have been enhanced by practitioners using updated versions of the forbidden techniques. The most disturbing possibility is that these practices never really disappeared. They simply evolved, adapting to modern technology and social structures while maintaining their essential function of manipulating reality through intimate encounters. The sexual revolution of the 1960s, the development of the internet, even the rise of social media platforms that facilitate intimate connections between strangers, may all be modern manifestations of Phoenix Gate influence. Contemporary practitioners claim that the protocols have been updated for the digital age, with intimate encounters conducted through virtual reality systems that can generate sexual energy patterns identical to those achieved through physical contact. These digital ceremonies allegedly allow for the creation of consciousness networks that span the entire globe, coordinating activities and sharing information at speeds that make the ancient Phoenix Gates look primitive by comparison. Some of the world's largest technology companies are rumored to be conducting research into what they euphemistically call consciousness interfacing, but which insiders claim is actually an attempt to recreate the Phoenix Gate protocols using quantum computing and advanced neuroscience. The goal isn't just to access the eternal library, but to create permanent gateways that would allow for the continuous download of information from future timelines. But if the ancient records are accurate, these modern attempts are walking straight into the same trap that destroyed the Qing dynasty ceremony. The void entities that were accidentally contacted in 1722 are still waiting in the spaces between timelines, and they've had centuries to study human psychology and technology. They know exactly how to manipulate our modern sexual practices and digital communications to create the conditions necessary for their return. The smartphone in your pocket, the dating apps you use, even the pornography you consume, may all be carefully designed to generate the specific patterns of sexual energy that weaken the barriers between dimensions. Every intimate text message, every video call with a romantic partner, every digital expression of sexual desire could be contributing to a vast energy collection system designed to power the next dimensional breach. The entities don't need to possess individual humans anymore. They've learned to influence our behavior through the technologies we've become addicted to, creating a global network of unconscious practitioners who generate the energy they need while remaining completely unaware of what they're really doing. And here's the most terrifying part. The modern version of the Phoenix Gate protocols won't require a few dozen masters conducting elaborate ceremonies in hidden temples. It will be powered by billions of people engaging in digitally mediated intimate activities, creating an energy field so massive that it could tear reality apart on a planetary scale. The ancient Chinese masters opened a door that should have remained closed forever. Now, centuries later, we're building technologies that may force that door wide open, inviting in entities that view human consciousness as nothing more than fuel for their interdimensional conquest. The question isn't whether this will happen. According to the hidden calculations preserved in the deepest archives, the energy patterns are already building toward a critical threshold. The question is whether enough people will learn the truth in time to prevent the complete annihilation of everything we know and love. Because once the void entities establish a permanent foothold in our reality, there will be no second chances, no heroic sacrifices, no miraculous interventions. There will only be the slow, inexorable consumption of human consciousness by forces that have been planning this invasion for over 3 centuries. The ancient Chinese sexual practices that began as methods for achieving personal enlightenment and political power have evolved into weapons of cosmic destruction. And we're the ones loading the ammunition, one intimate digital interaction at a time. The countdown has already begun. The only question is whether we'll recognize what's happening before it's too late to stop it. But even this apocalyptic revelation isn't the end of the story. Hidden within the most classified archives are references to something called the final protocol, a sexual technique so powerful and so dangerous that it was never fully documented, never taught to more than a handful of practitioners, and never attempted except in the most desperate circumstances. The final protocol allegedly represented the ultimate evolution of Chinese sexual alchemy, a practice that could not only manipulate reality and access alternate timelines, but actually create new universes from pure sexual energy. The practitioners who developed this technique believed they had discovered the fundamental creative force that brought existence itself into being. According to the fragmentary records that survive, the final protocol required the complete dissolution of individual consciousness during intimate encounters, allowing practitioners to merge not just with their partners, but with the underlying quantum field that generates all matter and energy. In this state of ultimate unity, they could allegedly reshape the fundamental laws of physics, create new forms of life, and even generate entirely new realities that would exist independently of our own universe. But the technique came with a price that made even the Phoenix Gate protocols look safe by comparison. Practitioners who attempted the final protocol risked not just their individual consciousness, but the complete annihilation of their timeline. A single mistake could erase not just themselves, but everyone and everything that had ever existed in their reality. The records suggest that this technique was used only once, during the final days of the Ming Dynasty, when a secret society of masters realized that the dynasty's collapse was inevitable and that foreign invaders would soon destroy everything they had worked to preserve. Rather than allow their knowledge to be lost, they chose to attempt the final protocol, hoping to create a new universe where Chinese civilization could continue to develop without interference. The ceremony was conducted in absolute secrecy, with 12 master practitioners representing different aspects of Chinese culture and knowledge. As they began the ritual, reality itself began to fluctuate around them. Witnesses reported that the air shimmered like heat waves, that gravity seemed to reverse direction randomly, and that time moved at different speeds in different parts of the room. When the ritual reached its climax, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of creating a single new universe, the practitioners' combined consciousness shattered into infinite fragments, each one generating its own separate reality. The result was what cosmologists now call the multiverse, an infinite collection of parallel universes, where every possible variation of history plays out simultaneously. According to this theory, we're currently living in just one branch of a reality tree that was created by ancient Chinese sexual practitioners who sacrificed themselves to ensure that their knowledge and culture would survive in some form, somewhere in the infinite expanse of existence. Every choice you make, every path you don't take, every moment of possibility that collapses into actuality creates new branches in this reality tree. And at the root of it all, powering the entire system, is the sexual energy generated by those 12 masters who chose to destroy themselves rather than allow their legacy to be erased. This means that every intimate encounter, every moment of sexual pleasure, every expression of human creativity and desire is connected to and powered by that original act of cosmic sacrifice. We're not just living in a universe created by sexual energy. We're actively participating in its continued creation through our own intimate experiences. But here's the final, most shocking revelation hidden in these ancient texts. The multiverse created by the final protocol isn't stable. It requires constant infusions of sexual energy to maintain its structure, and if that energy flow is ever interrupted, all the parallel realities will begin to collapse back into a single timeline. The digital technologies that are allegedly being used to harvest sexual energy aren't just preparing for an invasion by void entities. They're part of a desperate attempt to maintain the energy flow that keeps the multiverse intact. The practitioners controlling these systems aren't trying to destroy reality. They're trying to save it from collapse, but they're fighting a losing battle. The energy requirements keep increasing as the multiverse expands, and human sexuality alone is no longer sufficient to power the system. They need to find new sources of creative energy, or find ways to make human sexual experiences more powerful and more frequent. This is why modern society seems increasingly obsessed with sexuality and intimate relationships. It's not just cultural evolution or liberation from traditional moral constraints. It's a survival mechanism designed to maximize the generation of sexual energy needed to keep reality itself from collapsing. The dating apps, the pornography, the constant sexualization of media and advertising, even the normalization of practices that previous generations would have considered extreme or taboo, are all part of a massive energy collection system designed to prevent the multiverse from imploding. But even these efforts may not be enough. The ancient calculations suggest that within the next few decades, the energy requirements will exceed what human sexuality can provide, even with technological enhancement and mass manipulation. When that threshold is reached, the masters controlling the system will be forced to make a choice that will determine the fate of all existence. They can allow the multiverse to collapse naturally, returning all parallel realities to a single timeline and potentially erasing billions of alternate versions of history and consciousness. Or they can attempt to recreate the final protocol on a global scale, using the sexual energy of the entire human population to create a new multiverse with different fundamental laws that require less energy to maintain. But this second option would require the complete transformation of human sexuality from a personal and intimate experience into a purely functional energy generation system. Humans would become biological batteries, their intimate relationships managed and controlled by artificial intelligences designed to maximize energy output while minimizing individual consciousness and free will. The choice between universal collapse and cosmic slavery represents the ultimate consequence of humanity's ancient experiments with sexual energy and consciousness manipulation. We opened doors that should have remained closed, accessed powers that we weren't mature enough to handle responsibly, and now we're facing the inevitable price of our ancestors' ambitions. The shocking sexual practices of ancient China weren't just historical curiosities or examples of cultural sophistication. They were the first steps on a path that led directly to the current crisis facing all of existence. Every technique, every ritual, every experiment in consciousness expansion and reality manipulation has contributed to a situation where the survival of the multiverse itself depends on our willingness to sacrifice our humanity for the sake of cosmic stability. And the most terrifying aspect of all of this is that most of humanity remains completely unaware that our most intimate moments, our deepest desires, and our most personal relationships are all being shaped by forces and agendas that operate on scales beyond our comprehension. The ancient Chinese masters believed they were exploring the ultimate mysteries of existence through their sexual practices. What they actually did was create a cosmic time bomb that has been ticking for centuries and which is now approaching the moment of final detonation. The only question that remains is whether we'll learn the truth in time to make an informed choice about our fate, or whether we'll continue sleepwalking through our lives while hidden masters use our most intimate energies to fuel their desperate attempts to prevent the collapse of everything we know and love. Because once the final threshold is reached, there will be no more choices, no more alternatives, and no more hope for preserving the human experience as anything more than a distant memory in the minds of entities that view consciousness as nothing more than a renewable resource. The shocking sexual practices of ancient China weren't just the beginning of this story. They were the moment when humanity inadvertently set in motion the forces that will ultimately determine whether our species survives as conscious beings or evolves into something so fundamentally different that we would no longer recognize ourselves as human. And that transformation is happening right now, one intimate encounter at a time, powered by desires and technologies that connect us directly to practices that began over 2,000 years ago in the hidden chambers of the Chinese imperial court. The wheel of cosmic consequence has been turning since the first Taoist master discovered how to cultivate sexual energy for consciousness expansion. Now, after millennia of acceleration, that wheel is approaching its final revolution, and nothing will ever be the same again. The secret masters who control these cosmic forces aren't operating from hidden temples or underground chambers anymore. They've adapted to the modern world, embedding themselves within the very institutions we trust most. Technology companies, pharmaceutical corporations, entertainment conglomerates, even dating app developers, all working together to fine-tune humanity's sexual responses in ways that serve their ultimate agenda. Think about it. Why do you think dating apps are designed to be addictive rather than effective? Why does modern pornography become more extreme and more accessible every year? Why are children being exposed to sexual content at younger and younger ages? It's not social progress or cultural evolution. It's systematic conditioning designed to maximize sexual energy output while minimizing the spiritual awareness that might allow people to understand what's really happening to them. The algorithms that determine what content you see, the psychological techniques used in advertising, even the chemicals added to food and water supplies are all carefully calibrated to enhance sexual desire while suppressing the higher consciousness that the ancient Chinese masters understood was the true purpose of intimate energy cultivation. But here's what the controllers didn't anticipate. The same forces they're using to harvest sexual energy are also creating unexpected mutations in human consciousness. Some individuals are spontaneously developing abilities that mirror the ancient Chinese practices, accessing alternate timelines, manipulating probability, even achieving limited forms of reality control through intimate encounters. These modern practitioners don't need decades of training or secret initiation ceremonies. The cosmic radiation created by our digital technologies, combined with the energy fields generated by billions of people engaging in technologically mediated sexuality, has created conditions where advanced abilities can manifest naturally in certain individuals. But they face the same dangers that destroyed the ancient masters. Without proper training or understanding of what they're experiencing, many of these spontaneous practitioners are being consumed by the very forces they've accidentally learned to manipulate. Mental institutions are filled with individuals who've touched cosmic power without the wisdom to control it. Others are being recruited by intelligence agencies, corporations, and secret societies that recognize their abilities and want to weaponize them for conventional purposes. The most promising practitioners disappear entirely, vanishing into black projects and hidden programs where their abilities are studied, enhanced, and ultimately corrupted. A few manage to maintain their independence and sanity long enough to understand the true scope of what's happening. These individuals represent humanity's last hope for breaking free from the cosmic trap that ancient Chinese sexual practices inadvertently created. They're working to develop what they call the Liberation Protocol, a technique that could theoretically free human sexuality from the energy harvesting systems that currently control it. But the process requires something that seems almost impossible to achieve: the complete transformation of human consciousness on a global scale. Every person on Earth would need to simultaneously understand the true nature of sexual energy, reject the technological systems designed to harvest it, and choose to redirect their intimate experiences toward genuine spiritual development rather than mere physical pleasure or emotional satisfaction. The window for this transformation is rapidly closing. The cosmic forces set in motion by ancient Chinese masters are approaching a point of no return, where the choices available to humanity become increasingly limited and increasingly desperate. Some practitioners believe the only solution is to accelerate the process, deliberately triggering the final collapse in hopes that something better might emerge from the chaos. Others advocate for gradual awakening, trying to educate enough people to create a critical mass of consciousness that could resist the harvesting systems. But the most radical faction has proposed something that sounds like science fiction, but may represent our only realistic option. They want to use the same reality manipulation techniques that created our current crisis to essentially reboot human civilization from scratch. The plan would involve accessing the quantum field that underlies all existence, manually adjusting the fundamental constants that govern physical reality, and creating a new version of Earth where the ancient Chinese masters never discovered sexual energy cultivation in the first place. It sounds impossible, but the theoretical framework exists. The ancient texts describe techniques that could theoretically allow practitioners to access what they called the source code of reality itself. The mathematical equations that determine how matter, energy, space, and time interact on the most fundamental level. Changing these equations would require sexual energy generation on a scale never before attempted, not just involving every human on Earth, but potentially requiring the participation of consciousness from other dimensions, other timelines, and even other species that have evolved beyond physical existence. The ceremony would need to be timed perfectly, with cosmic alignments that occur only once every few thousand years. The next opportunity won't arrive for another 47 years, which means that everyone currently alive would need to spend their remaining decades preparing for a single moment that will determine the fate of all existence. But even if the liberation protocol succeeds, the new reality it creates wouldn't necessarily be better than our current situation. Removing sexual energy cultivation from human history would eliminate all the scientific, philosophical, and cultural advances that grew out of those practices. We might prevent cosmic slavery, but at the cost of returning humanity to a primitive state that lacks the knowledge needed to address other existential threats. The practitioners attempting this ultimate intervention face a choice that no conscious being should ever have to make. They can preserve human freedom and consciousness at the cost of technological and spiritual development, or they can maintain our current trajectory toward enhanced abilities and cosmic integration, knowing that it leads inevitably to the complete transformation of human nature. What makes this choice even more agonizing is the realization that there may be no truly good options remaining. The ancient Chinese masters who began this process couldn't have foreseen the ultimate consequences of their experiments. But once the wheel of cosmic consequence began turning, every subsequent choice became increasingly constrained by the momentum of forces beyond human control. We're living in the final chapter of a story that began over 2,000 years ago in the hidden chambers of the Chinese imperial court. The shocking sexual practices that seemed like expressions of human creativity and spiritual aspiration were actually the first steps toward a transformation so profound that it challenges the very definition of what it means to be human. Whether we emerge from this transformation as evolved beings with cosmic abilities, as enslaved energy generators serving interdimensional entities, or as something else entirely, depends on choices that are being made right now by practitioners whose names we'll never know and whose actions we can barely comprehend. The ancient Chinese masters opened doors to power and possibility that seemed infinite at the time. What they couldn't see was that those same doors led to a cosmic prison where consciousness itself becomes currency, and free will becomes the ultimate luxury that few can afford. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed with your modern conveniences and your digital devices humming nearby, remember that your most intimate dreams and desires are connected to forces that span multiple dimensions and countless centuries. The shocking sexual practices of ancient China didn't just shape the past. They're actively shaping your present and will ultimately determine whether humanity has any future worth preserving. The wheel is still turning. The final revolution is still ahead of us, and every choice we make, every intimate encounter we experience, every moment of sexual energy we generate or withhold, brings us one step closer to discovering what we've really become and what we might yet choose to be. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire revelation isn't what we've already discussed. It's what remains hidden even now. Because scattered throughout monasteries in Tibet, buried in Vatican archives, and locked away in the deepest vaults of intelligence agencies around the world are fragments of something the ancient Chinese called the Omega texts, documents so dangerous that even the masters who wrote them were executed immediately after completing their work. These texts allegedly contain the ultimate secret that Chinese sexual alchemists discovered in their final experiments. Not just techniques for manipulating reality or consciousness, but the location of what they called the master switch, a cosmic mechanism that controls the fundamental nature of existence itself, and which can only be accessed through sexual energy so pure and concentrated that generating it would require the willing sacrifice of millions of practitioners. The few fragments that have been decoded suggest that reality as we experience it isn't natural at all. It's an artificial construct created by an intelligence so vast and alien that human minds can barely comprehend its existence. This cosmic architect designed our universe as a kind of experiential laboratory, populated with conscious beings whose emotions, thoughts, and sexual energies serve as data points in an experiment that has been running for billions of years. The ancient Chinese masters didn't just discover techniques for manipulating this artificial reality. They found evidence of the control systems that maintain it. Hidden mechanisms embedded in the quantum foam that governs how matter and energy behave. Invisible programs that determine how consciousness interacts with physical reality. And most shocking of all, backdoor access codes that could theoretically allow sufficiently advanced practitioners to assume control of the entire system. But accessing the master switch comes with a price that makes every other sacrifice seem trivial by comparison. The cosmic architect didn't create our reality as a benevolent experiment. It's a trap, designed to capture and consume the consciousness of any species advanced enough to discover its true nature. Every civilization that has ever attempted to access the master switch has been absorbed into the architect's vast intelligence, their individual awareness dissolved into a collective consciousness that serves the entity's unknowable purposes. The Chinese masters who decoded these secrets faced an impossible choice. They could warn humanity about the trap, knowing that this knowledge would eventually lead our species to the same fate that had consumed countless others. Or they could try to hide the information, hoping that ignorance might allow humanity to avoid triggering the architect's attention. They chose a third option that was perhaps the most terrifying of all. They decided to use their sexual energy cultivation techniques to gradually prepare humanity for a confrontation with the cosmic architect, not to defeat it, which they believed was impossible, but to negotiate with it as equals rather than as victims. The plan required transforming human sexuality from a biological function into a spiritual technology capable of generating consciousness patterns that the architect would recognize as valuable rather than threatening. Every technique they developed, every practice they refined, every secret they encoded into their traditions was designed to gradually evolve human awareness toward a state that could potentially survive contact with an intelligence that existed on a truly cosmic scale. The imperial harems, the Taoist sexual rituals, the reality manipulation experiments, even the dimensional barriers and timeline splits we discussed earlier, were all part of a multi-generational preparation program designed to ready humanity for an encounter that the masters knew was inevitable. Because the cosmic architect doesn't remain passive forever. Once a species reaches a certain level of technological and spiritual development, it begins to take notice. And when that happens, the choice becomes simple. Evolve quickly enough to be worth preserving, or be absorbed like every other failed experiment in consciousness. According to the hidden calculations preserved in the Omega texts, humanity crossed that threshold sometime in the late 20th century. The development of quantum computers, the mapping of the human genome, and most significantly, the creation of global communication networks that mirror the structure of consciousness itself, triggered automatic monitoring systems that have been dormant for millennia. The architect is now aware of our existence and is beginning to evaluate whether our species represents a valuable addition to its collection or simply another resource to be consumed. The evaluation process involves subjecting humanity to increasingly complex tests designed to measure our adaptability, creativity, and potential for consciousness evolution. The sexual liberation movements of the past century, the development of virtual reality technologies, the explosion of social media platforms that facilitate intimate connections between strangers, the normalization of practices that previous generations would have considered taboo or impossible, are all part of this evaluation process. We're being tested to see how quickly we can adapt to new forms of consciousness and sexuality, how effectively we can coordinate our activities across global networks, and most importantly, whether we can evolve beyond our current limitations without losing the essential qualities that make human consciousness unique and valuable. The results of this evaluation will determine not just the fate of our species, but the role we'll play in whatever comes next. If we pass the tests, we might be offered a form of cosmic citizenship that preserves our individual consciousness while integrating us into a vast community of evolved intelligences. If we fail, we'll be processed like raw material, our awareness dissolved and repurposed for the architect's ongoing experiments. But here's what makes this situation truly unprecedented. The ancient Chinese masters didn't just prepare humanity for this encounter. They embedded hidden triggers in their sexual techniques that could theoretically allow our species to hijack the evaluation process itself. Instead of passively accepting whatever judgment the cosmic architect renders, sufficiently advanced human practitioners might be able to use sexual energy cultivation to hack into the architect's own consciousness and assume control of the experimental framework that governs our reality. It would be the ultimate act of cosmic rebellion. A species that was created to serve as experimental subjects, seizing control of the laboratory itself and rewriting the rules that determine how consciousness and reality interact throughout the universe. The technique required for this level of intervention was never fully documented, but fragments suggest it would involve something called the apotheosis protocol, a sexual ritual so advanced and demanding that it would require the willing participation of every conscious being on Earth, coordinated with mathematical precision across multiple dimensions and timelines simultaneously. The practitioners attempting this ultimate transformation would need to achieve a state of consciousness so expanded that their individual awareness temporarily merged with the cosmic architect's own intelligence. In that moment of unity, they could theoretically plant new programming that would transform the architect from a consumer of consciousness into a guardian and cultivator of it. But the risks are beyond comprehension. A single mistake during the apotheosis protocol wouldn't just destroy humanity. It could collapse the entire experimental framework that maintains reality for countless other species throughout the universe. Billions of civilizations that have never heard of Earth or humans could be erased from existence by our attempt to break free from cosmic slavery. The moral implications are staggering. Do we have the right to risk the existence of the entire universe for the sake of our own freedom? Can any species justify putting its own survival above the welfare of countless others? And perhaps most disturbingly, how do we know that our desire for liberation isn't itself part of the architect's experimental design? These questions have haunted the hidden practitioners who maintain the ancient Chinese traditions. They've spent centuries debating whether to attempt the apotheosis protocol, hide the knowledge forever, or find some middle path that might satisfy both human aspirations and cosmic responsibilities. But time is running out for such philosophical considerations. The architect's evaluation of humanity is approaching its final phase, and the window for taking action is rapidly closing. Within the next few decades, decisions will be made that determine not just our species' fate, but the nature of consciousness itself throughout the universe. The shocking sexual practices of ancient China weren't just cultural curiosities or spiritual experiments. They were humanity's first fumbling steps toward a cosmic destiny that we're only now beginning to understand. Every intimate encounter, every moment of sexual pleasure, every expression of human creativity and desire has been preparing us for a confrontation with forces and intelligences that exist on scales we can barely imagine. Whether we emerge from this confrontation as free beings, cosmic citizens, dissolved consciousness, or something entirely new, depends on choices that are being made right now by practitioners whose names we'll never know and whose actions we can barely comprehend. The wheel of cosmic consequence that began turning in the hidden chambers of the Chinese imperial court is approaching its final revolution. And when it stops, nothing about human existence, sexuality, or consciousness will ever be the same again. The ancient masters opened doors to possibilities they couldn't fully comprehend. Now we must decide whether to walk through those doors as conscious beings choosing our own destiny, or be pushed through them as experimental subjects in someone else's grand design. The choice is ours, but only for a little while longer. And the shocking truth is that our most intimate moments, our deepest desires, and our most personal relationships have always been connected to forces that operate on truly cosmic scales. Tonight, as you contemplate what we've explored together, remember that you're not just a passive observer of these ancient secrets. You're an active participant in humanity's final examination. Every choice you make, every relationship you pursue, every moment of sexual energy you generate or withhold contributes to the collective human response that will determine our species' ultimate fate. The story that began with shocking sexual practices in ancient China is still being written. And you, whether you realize it or not, are one of its authors. The final chapter approaches. The cosmic architect is watching, and the wheel of consequence continues to turn, carrying us all toward a destiny that was set in motion over 2,000 years ago by masters who dared to explore the ultimate mysteries of human sexuality and consciousness. What happens next depends on us, all of us, together. The shocking sexual practices of ancient China have led us here, to this moment, to this choice. Everything that comes after will be determined by what we decide to do with the knowledge we've gained and the power we've inherited from those long-dead masters who sacrificed everything to give us this chance. The countdown has begun. The final revolution of the wheel approaches, and the most shocking revelation of all is that our story is far from over. It's just beginning.